Well, hello, listeners, and hello, Peter Wanless. We had a week off, didn't we? We're back together now. How did you find your break?
Yeah, a week off. Thank you very much. I mean, interestingly, listeners may be interested. Debra and I just had a blazing row. This is what happens when we don't engage with one another for the best part of 10 days. There's a whole lot of kind of pent up this, that, and the other. So yeah, no, very good. Thank you. Someone did say, I hope you enjoyed your break or your holiday, and I kind of thought, actually, that's completely the wrong way around. The reason we haven't done the podcast is I think both of us have been absolutely inundated with other things. So it's a sort of the opposite of a holiday. I feel rather ready for a holiday. We had a great event at the House of Lords for the Five Rights Foundation, where
Fantastic.
I've taken on the chair, and Baroness Kidron was describing to our supporters and funders, past, present and future, the kind of growing up of this tiny charity which she has founded into something that's a little bit bigger but still very small in the overall scheme of things. And it was a great pleasure and privilege to be a part of that.
On Radio 4. I was driving up to Stratford-on-Avon yesterday listening, and I heard her talking about Five Rights, and
Yeah, it's very topical because Ofcom have just offered some kind of observations of what they've done up to this point, which, as with so many of these kind of online safety things, is okay, all right. It's a lot better than it could have been without the legislation and without them being there, but it's nothing like sufficient in terms of what we want and need. So yeah, plenty done, plenty still to do, and that was the story that we were telling. Anyway, so yeah, I'd been doing that, and then other bits and pieces. I've got a bit of a kind of cricket fortnight coming up. I've got I'm doing a speech to an MCC dinner.
Wow.
My life in cricket. So that's got to be written.
And I'm not invited, Peter?
Well, you're not a member, unfortunately, because
you can't
it's members only. And whereas the queue for me, as a kind of state school boy with one chip on his shoulder, was 23 years, the queue for you as a woman is like
400.
3 times that, I should think. So yeah, sorry, one day, but yeah.
I rely on you to fight the good fight. Although we're not getting off terribly well to the Ashes, are we? Anyway, this isn't a cricket podcast. We have to keep reminding ourselves of that, don't we?
And how about you? What have you been up to?
Oh, same as you. Absolutely insanely busy. I mean, this week alone, I've done 3 speaking engagements, up and down the country, and then went to a dinner in London where a very dear friend of mine, a chap called Ray Locke, stood down as the chair of Stoll Foundation. And so, so I've been absolutely crazy busy, like just haven't stopped traveling and speaking. And of course, it's like, and each speaking engagement was different audiences, different topics. It's always easier when there's just the one thing I can talk about. But when I've got to sort of, I think I'll remember which lot is this.
Yeah.
Which message then? Although, to be honest, mostly my messages are more or less the same. Be brave, be bold. Don't, stop feeling sorry for yourselves. Like, nothing changes unless we speak out, and all the rest of it. Be courageous and you matter. So I always, whatever the topic is, I always end up with that core message.
And you had a night out at a gig seeing Jacinda Ardern, didn't you? Because I had a night out with my brother seeing this band called the Sherlocks, and I was thinking of them actually as you were talking about your tour and good evening so and so, and we went to see them in Wells, which is England's smallest city.
I
think. But they kept saying, "Hello, Wells. How are you, Wells?"
Funny. And 4 people, we're fine.
Yeah.
Well, I must admit, Jacinda Ardern was absolutely phenomenal. It was Sunday afternoon, and she's being interviewed somewhat puzzlingly by Bill Bailey, the comedian, which, although I think she knows him, so that might be why. But typically those kind of interviews, you'd normally be interviewed by a professional interviewer or a political commentator or a newscaster or something. So that did strike me as quite unusual. But she was just so real and honest and truthful about it. And apparently there's a film, I think, coming out this week called The Prime Minister or something, which is because her husband's a documentary filmmaker.
Yeah.
And we saw a little bit of it. And it's like when she became Prime Minister, he said, well, why let's capture some of these moments for ourselves. And then as it went through and then she finally took the decision to step down, they thought, actually, this might make a really good documentary, really good film. So that comes out, I think it might even be today, actually. It's today the 5th, I can't remember.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, we're recording on the 5th anyway.
Yeah. But she was talking about, this whole new way of looking at leadership, about compassion and kindness and sympathy, and not being, not trying to be driven too much by winning points against the opposition, and, and also the challenges of leading an absolute disaster. So she was Prime Minister when the 2 shootings at the mosques in Christchurch, and all those people died. And then about a week after that, there was the earthquake. Again in Christchurch, I think, actually.
Yeah, it was.
And then COVID, and talking about her emotion. She talked about her emotional reactions to stuff, not the, how it felt in those things and what felt right and what felt wrong. And she said, because of course New Zealand, I think, had one of the lowest cases of COVID in the whole world, because they basically just closed off the whole borders. And she said she found it really, but she never stopped worrying ever. And she said she was at a concert in, I think, December 2020, she said, I can't remember, but around about then. And there were thousands of people in this venue, in this concert. And she said, and I was stood there, and all I could think was, if one person in this concert has COVID, this is a super spreader event. She said, you just could not let go of the fear of it. But also how difficult because, her deciding to close down the whole country wasn't a popular call. Lots of her own people objected strenuously to that. And, because family couldn't get in, and they couldn't go and see each other and things like that. So, and the difficult challenges of leadership, having to make difficult decisions, which actually, Peter, segues beautifully into something I thought we could have a good chat about today. And that's about the challenges of making difficult decisions at board level, at governance level. So you will have seen, of course, this week, the Women's Institute and Girlguiding have taken the decision to ban trans girls and trans women from their organisations. Now, I don't want to get into the rights and wrongs and the ins and outs of all of that, but thinking about it, it really struck me how very difficult those kinds of decisions are. I mean, both organisations have issued statements saying they were basically forced into doing it, and that they still saw themselves as trans inclusive organisations, and they were going to have conversations with the trans community about how to engage them. But you do sort of think, because not just about this issue, but there are other quite contentious, complex issues that come up to boards where the board themselves are put in the position of having to decide what to do and how to do it because of external influences. So one assumes that these organisations had pressure put on them by somebody, because otherwise, why would they have taken the decision when they didn't want to, if you see what I mean, when they felt forced to? So there's also this thing about, boards are supposed to act independently. We've had these conversations before, Peter. They're supposed to act independently without undue influence from others. And yet, if you have to make a decision, whatever the issue is about, that you don't really want to make, how does that square with that not being unduly influenced? So I think it's very difficult. I mean, I feel deeply for the leadership and the staff of both organisations, because this is an ugly issue. But it's not. There are other issues that massively affect boards, and where they have to make quite tricky decisions about what they will and won't support. Anyway.
Well, so there's so many ways we could take this, isn't there? We could talk about the specifics. We could talk about the general. I mean, there. So my instinctive reaction to the specific, without opening the whole thing up, is yes, the Women's Institute and Girlguiding are in a particularly difficult situation because they declare themselves as membership organisation for women, and there's been a law change around the definition of woman, which they've then had to come to terms with. So they can react to it by blaming the law, or they can think about how they might reconstitute themselves or present themselves in a different way. But when you talk about the external factors that impact more generally on boards, I mean, the law is going to be one, isn't it? When there's a law change, whether it's a regulatory operational requirement or whatever, quite often the Charity Commission will help us, especially smaller charities, navigate their way through that. And organisations such as yours can offer insight and and expertise. So the law is going to be one external factor. Money is very often a factor which leads boards into places they would rather not go. So, I didn't become the chief executive of the NSPCC to make 150 social workers redundant, but 3 or 4 years ago, that's something that I had to do because the judgment was that for the money that we had got and the outcomes we were seeking to achieve and what the government was doing with its money, that was the best way of remaining distinct. But that was a really uncomfortable and challenging conversation. And you could say the same. I know we said we're not a cricket podcast, but at Somerset cricket at the moment, there's all this private equity money and available, and investors pouring cash into the game, but in exchange for levels of control and influence, which your traditional county cricket model set up to be kind of owned and operated by the members is totally different from. So that to me is probably an area at the moment that is a kind of classic example of a board which will have elected member directors that are going to have to ask themselves some really challenging questions about what do we believe in, what do we stand for, what are the values of the club, why did we come here, but at the same time the existential threat that if we don't contemplate at least other organizational and operational models, the whole club may no longer exist in the same way. And then there's external pressures of the kind I think you were kind of indicating, where people whip up campaigns based on particular views of the world or perspectives in contested territory that can again feel uncomfortable. And in any group of 6, 8, 12 trustees, you're going to have different opinions, aren't you? It's one of those kind of classic questions that are asked at trustee interviews about what do you understand by the term collective responsibility?
Yeah, exactly. Actually, it's interesting because I wrote an article for Civil Society magazine, which I think has been published already, about how do you handle it when you disagree on a board? What are the sort of behaviours? I have to caveat to leaders. You know all this already, Peter, but I'm very, very good at giving advice. I'm not quite as good at following my own advice.
Same
so hands up here that I don't always get it right. But it is an interesting thing because there was a charity that I worked with. In fact, I think I put them as an example without naming them in my book. There's a charity I worked with, which they were serving a group of people with a particular disability, young people actually with a particular disability. And it was really interesting because some of the board members felt that their job was about servicing these individuals and that they shouldn't have to pay for it at all, even if they could. And somebody else thought that, lots of the individuals who were being served by the charity came from relatively well-off backgrounds, and so therefore they should pay for the services. And there was this massive row that just endless about, we shouldn't charge anybody, it's not fair. Well, it's like, and it's really interesting because you could see both points of view, but they absolutely were unable to come to a decision. And as far as I know, they're still fighting about it to this day. I don't know whether they ever managed to resolve it, so it's not always, so contentious issues on boards are not always necessarily these big, huge, threatening issues. They're very often massive issues of perception within the board, and how often boards sort of forget that the arguments that they're having at board level, I can absolutely guarantee you, are happening within the organisation that they're in charge of. And I really, in Women's Institute and Girlguiding, I really, really feel for the leadership, the staff, the volunteers. It must be a really, really difficult place to work in at the moment. I think sometimes boards forget those ramifications. I don't think they mean to, because they're sat in a room arguing with each other. They completely forget that you're not operating in isolation, and if you make a decision, it has impact. If you don't make a decision, it also has impact, on what happens.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I think I've talked about this before, but when I first arrived at the NSPCC, there was a huge debate, really legitimate, interesting, passionate debate about Miles, who was the boy in the iconic black and white full stop advert.
Oh, yes,
NSPCC, who cried in his cot.
Little blonde.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there were trustees who thought it was the most powerful visual articulation of the pain and upset that a child goes through, and it was filmed ethically and all the rest of
Yeah.
it, and he didn't really cry, and there was all this
Yeah.
sort of stuff, and that this was the way in which you mobilized behind your cause. And then there were equally strong passionate views that this was exploitation of children's misery, and the NSPCC should be about solutions, and it shouldn't be parading little children in this sort of way to show them being unhappy. And you never there's some real values-based arguments there about what you stand for and the sort of charity you want to be in, and you're probably never going to get, let's say, if there's board of trouble, and you're not going to get 12 people on a trustee board at the NSPCC who are going to agree about that, and it's probably right that you don't.
Yeah,
there's some really great there's Matthew Said's book Rebel Ideas, where he talks about diversity of thinking on the board, and how it's really good to have arguments like as we do off and on air about things where we don't necessarily hold quite the same view, because we think in a rather different way, and it can feel uncomfortable, and at the end you have to come to some sort of decision which is not consensus, and it feels uncomfortable.
Alignment.
When you go out of the room, you've all got to support the issue, but you might not feel as good about yourself and one another as when you're in a group of people who are very like-minded, thinking in exactly the same way, arrive at a comfortable conclusion which you're all satisfied with. And when I read that Matthew Said book, it gave me confidence confidence to lead that uncomfortableness, as opposed to being concerned that I was failing to get everyone brilliantly aligned with one another.
I think there's also something, because one of the real challenges with, so for example, you and I can have a blazing row like we just did, and it absolutely does not change how I feel about you, and I hope it doesn't change how you feel about me. Like, the issue is separate from the relationship, if you see what I mean. And I think that that's part of the challenge of these sort of contentious, difficult things, is that people take it personally and they make it personal. So they attack individuals, and they, when the reality is when you're, especially when you're operating in a space like the charitable sector, and when there are, refugees and asylum seekers are sensitive, contentious issues, because lots of people don't think we should be supporting them. When you're, other sort of criminal justice sector, when they're supporting, there's a charity, for example, that works with paedophiles to try and understand how they become that way and how to stop them. All the rest of it. Super unpopular, and nobody will ever admit to funding them, because we just want to ban them. So these aren't the only difficult challenges to get to. But I think we have to encourage people generally to separate the person from the issue. You can be absolutely passionate about an issue. You can argue provided you're separating that from how you feel about an individual, particularly in a charity and a board level. And so I think it's that when people criticize us for what we've done, we have to not take it personally. We have to remember what they're criticizing is a decision we made or an issue we raised. They're not actually saying you're a bad person. And when we are challenging people, I think we need to focus on the issue. We're not saying you're a bad person for making that decision. What we're saying is that was a bad decision in my view, and you talk about the decision. But it's not easy to do, because we're human beings, and we don't like falling out with each other, really.
No, and I think distinguishing, if it's possible to distinguish between evidence and moral conviction, then that because there are some things which each of us will have. Some people have more of them, some people have fewer of them, that they just fundamentally believe are right or wrong. So again, to bring it to the area of kind of child protection, whether you should ever hit a child is something that there are some people that are absolutely, it's the first thing they would say above everything else, that that is more important not to do that than anything in the whole world. And therefore, why would anyone do anything other than make that illegal.
Yeah.
And then you've got all sorts of gradations of opinion, through to, it never did me any harm, to I will discipline my children how I want to discipline them, and look at the positive impact this had when I disciplined my child in that way. And so you can argue there's a discussion to be had there, but if you can distinguish in the conversations between people who are asserting that why they believe it is morally right, and people who are illustrating the impact that this has had, because there's years and years of evidence that can be drawn on now, then I think that helps. And what gets my goat sometimes in some of these conversations about values-based issues is when people now, please, Deborah, don't take this personally. I'm not relating this to any conversation that you and I have ever had. But there are some conversations I have been in with some people where I feel like they just assert that if you're not with them, you will be on the wrong side of history. And I just think that's a bit lazy if you're not admitting that actually there's something deep in your kind of values that is making you assert. Well, let's explore that and understand why you judge there to be an inevitability about this, because things do change dramatically over time, don't they? I found an old newspaper, Leeds student newspaper, from when I was at university. So we're talking mid-80s, and it was about the security guards at the student union who would not take the keys from the gay and lesbian group after they had locked up their room, because they thought they would get AIDS from it, and it was a kind of danger. Now that's not only in my lifetime, that's in my adult lifetime. That people have those attitudes.
It's an interesting thing, though, isn't it? Because, talk about evidence and we talk about the law, and evidence is a very slippery concept, because, there is a fact, let's say, that, there's been a 20% increase in individuals donating to donkey charities. Okay, that's the fact. How that fact is interpreted can be, so you can either say that's a good thing, more people care about donkeys, well, that's a terrible thing because they're not caring about other things. So I think the thing that people often also get stuck on is saying, well, the evidence shows. Well, the evidence just says this. What it shows is what you choose it to show, and it's the same with the law. It always drives me nuts when people say, well, it's the law, because the issue we started this with, that's a little bit slippery, so I don't think the law is that clear, but the law very rarely is. You speak to any group of lawyers about something, why do we always end up in courts? Because one lawyer will interpret it this way and another this way, and then you end up going on a head-to-head between two organisations, and then it has to get decided by somebody else, and then there's appeals, and courts overturn things. So I think that we also have to remember that there's very rarely hard and fast something I can shove in your face and say, well, the law says this, because actually laws aren't always that clear. They are open to interpretation, and they're constantly evolving. We're constantly having to update laws and regulations and things like that. So, and I think it's difficult though, Peter, isn't it? Because for me personally, when I feel that a group in society, whether that's refugees and asylum seekers, whether that's trans people, whether that's people with HIV and AIDS, where I feel that they are being demonised and excluded and made to feel less than, that I think that if you have a moral feeling about that, you have a duty to speak up about it. You have to get that other people won't feel the same. I understand that, but I think, because I remember somebody saying to me years ago, the worst kind of ally is a silent ally. They're of no use to you whatsoever, and because things go wrong in society because good people keep quiet, or because the vast majority of people don't want to get into the fight, or they don't want to be covered in blood and gore afterwards. Whatever you care about, I do feel that if something matters to you, whichever side you're on, don't be a silent ally. If you feel strongly about it, then speak up, whatever the issue is, and there are many.
But that does bring us back to a conversation we've often had about what we say and do and ally ourselves to as individuals, and what we can and should say and do as our
charities,
organisations, and as charities, then we have to come back to our charitable purpose. And I think in the particular case of the Women's Institute and Girlguiding, they're caught in this crossfire of the contested territory of whether trans girls are girls. And there are very strong views about that matter, and everything else kind of flows from there. So then they have to come back to their charitable purpose. What is it that we are here to achieve, and for whom? And in less contested space, I guess, but no less controversial, is the refugee and asylum seeker issue, and the language that's being used in this space. And you've written a piece this week, haven't you, about tell us a bit about that, about Squids, because that's a brilliant example of allyship beyond a narrow definition of who is a refugee and asylum seeker charity, I suppose.
Well, I was talking to a colleague in the sector who, they themselves aren't particularly necessarily homelessness, but they are refugee and asylum seeker charity, and obviously all the things, because there's quite a lot of homelessness around refugees and asylum seekers as well, for obvious reasons. But anyway, what was really interesting is she was saying how they'd felt so under attack and so beleaguered and so unsupported generally over the last few years, and that what had happened is that earlier in the year, this year in August, so the certain narrators have been using the I would call the excuse of violence against women and girls to say that, to be anti-refugees and asylum seekers. They're basically saying they're not safe. Our girls aren't safe. That's why they've got to go. Mm-hmm. And the violence against women and girls sector, as well as other non-refugee migrants sector, there are about 200 organisations in the end. Lots of them women's groups. Some universities, some other charities not directly related to that, who wrote to the Prime Minister to say, do not let this issue damage our cause. How dare you basically use our cause as a weapon to demonise and alienate, refugees and migrants. And I was really just so taken aback, because she was quite emotional when she was saying to me about how much this letter had mattered to the refugee and migrant sector. And how much that when you're working in a space where it's not a popular space to be in, it can feel so incredibly lonely. You expect your colleagues to sympathise and understand, but when somebody external to it steps up, and then somebody else was saying to me, got to be super careful. We've had this discussion before, Peter, haven't we, about not straying too far outside your charitable objects. And there's a degree of truth in that, but the reality is if you're dealing with human beings in particular, there's almost nothing that goes on with human beings that won't affect you. I mean, NSBC's about kids, but pound to penny, some of those kids were vulnerable because they were the children of refugees and migrant workers who were being abused, and they didn't have enough food, and you know what I mean? So it's like, actually, if you really do feel you want to stand up for another organisation, you can very easily find a way to justify it in the context of your own objects or your own, set of being. But I just think, let me just finish. So the Humboldt, so I was so struck by this, I decided to write about it, about the fact of us coming together. And there's a species of squid called the Humboldt squid. And what they do is, when they're under attack from sharks and stuff, they kind of gather together really closely. And then they have a biomechanical mechanism whereby they can generate electricity and make flashes. And so they move around really swiftly, bunched together, making all these flashes. And it's a very effective way of deterring predators and sharks and things like that. And I just thought there's something, because if you're a sector that feels under attack, if you're if you're representing a minority group or an unpopular issue, a contentious issue, you can very much feel like the lone squid, with this pathetic little, flash that isn't going to scare anybody. And you need to be surrounded by others in solidarity who are flashing equally enthusiastically. Anyway, so that's where that came from.
Yeah, and it's really a bit being a good sector citizen and supporting those who are in difficulty or in contested territory. That's a good thing. Something that I found a significant part of my time at the NSPCC again, though, was choosing where and when to offer that support, and then you offer it somewhere, and then you get criticized for not offering it somewhere else, and before you know it, you're offering your support in places where other people are more expert than you, and then they start to feel threatened by you tramping onto their territory. So it's not an easy one to get right, but I think that you can. Your refugee and asylum seeker letter is an illustration of where people were looking for help and were welcoming some assistance from a site. So that was a good one to pick. I was also thinking back to when I was a communications director in the government, and made a few speeches. Somewhere or other, I had a sort of, I can't remember if it was 6, 8 or 10 lessons for excellent communications that I had learned in my time in those sorts of roles. And one of them was about securing praise from other people, particularly unlikely sources. So if the chief executive of an organization is saying his or her organization is brilliant and their cause is really important, well, of course they would. But when it's heard from an unlikely source, it's so much more powerful. So that was definitely a lesson. Another lesson that I remember was, engage with people who you're likely to be working with and pick up the phone to them from time to time, because
if you can't do it publicly, you can at least make a phone call, can't you?
And do it in the good times, because if the first time you need help or support
is when you're in trouble,
then people are less likely to understand how you've got into that situation in the first place.
It's very true. It's coming back to this silent majority thing, though. It just comes back to me all the time, that Martin Niemöller quote, or I don't know what you'd call it. So for listeners who don't recognise the name, Martin Niemöller was a Christian, I think he was a vicar perhaps or something, anyway, during the Second World War. And he's the one who's very famous for saying, they came after the trade unionists and I did not speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. They came after the communists and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. They came after the Jews and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me and there was nobody left to speak up for me. And I just think that's so, it's the power of solidarity, the power of speaking together. I mean, I was saying only this week, most changes in policy and law happen through weight of numbers. It's not some minister suddenly waking up one morning and thinking, oh, I think I might do something about that issue. It's almost always loads of people coming together, petitioning, writing, speaking about it, going on marches, going on protests, sending letters, signing petitions and things like that. And that, there's an awful lot we can achieve when we act collectively, often much more than we ever can do as an individual.
And doing that on an issue or in a kind of context where there is polarized debate that is creating tension and anger, in and of itself, is particularly challenging. Do you have to take a side, or is one on the side of compassion and kindness? And that's my sort of instinct, but it can also be rather kind of wishy-washy and stuck in the middle, and sometimes there is a side to be taken. And then you need to know and understand why you're taking the side. What's the evidence that's leading you to that position, and or is it moral purpose or some combination of the two? And have you and if you're doing it for the charity, have you got your trustees behind you? Oh, is that the dog? We better stop.
The postman's just turned up and Arthur saw him through the window. Sorry, listeners. That's my completely deaf dog, Arthur, big basset hound, who can't hear his own bark and is hence very loud in his barking.
Oh, you better go and deal with Arthur. I think we've run an overtime anyway. So
yeah. And I forgive you, Peter, for disagreeing with me.
I haven't disagreed with you as violently on the actual podcast as the conversation we had before the podcast.
Exactly, that's what I'm forgiving you for.
We might have to do a bonus episode because I need to put you straight on one or two things,
and vice versa.
Very good.
All right, thanks.
All right,
listeners. Next week.
See you soon. Bye.